actual fee on streaming giants like Netflix and Hulu and the rest of them to have more Canadian content. This is something that the Prime Minister had already rolled back to be able to prevent this deal going sideways. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney also suspended negotiations, and he said that he called the final U.S. terms unfair and economically unacceptable for Canada. Now, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has accused Canada of making new demands and withdrawing earlier commitments. So this is the he said, she said, right? Both sides are blaming each other. And the United States now will impose the 50% tariffs on approximately $28 billion on Canadian goods, worth of Canadian goods. So that's $28 billion. And President Trump has subsequently threatened another 50% of tariffs on Canadian vehicles, trucks, automotive parts starting January 1st, 2027. So that's been something additional that the president has announced. Now, these negotiations were intended to essentially reduce sector-specific tariffs and perhaps even on a broader scale prepare for CUSMA's discussion, right? So the CUSMA review came and went on July 1st. It was supposed to be the target date to renew CUSMA for 16 years. Because July 1st deadline was passed with the president saying that he does not want to renew it for 16 years, CUSMA is still in effect, but what this means is it goes into an annual negotiation. And so perhaps this was also greater discussion for what would take place in a broader CUSMA discussions. Now, Canada and the United States have deeply integrated automotive sector. We know that when it comes to the manufacturing supply chains. So when it comes to meaningful tariffs that the president's talking about, this could essentially raise costs and disrupt production on both sides of the border. So we know when it comes to an automotive part, it crosses the border multiple times before it becomes a component of a vehicle. So that's going to be the very hard part of understanding how these tariffs are going to be added on. Now, when it comes to President Trump and in terms of where this 50% tariff comes from, it's essentially evoked on Section 338 of the Tariff Act of the 1930, which permits duties up to 50% when a foreign country, in this case Canada, is determined to discriminate against American commerce. Well, the president saw that when it came to American alcohol being removed from the shelves, then it dipped in terms of 80%, fell in terms of the revenues that were going into the United States from American alcohol that was sold in Canada. So the president saw a dip when it came to the automotive industry, when it came to American alcohol, and then therefore they saw that it was in their position to enact this Tariff Act of 1930, which has never really been done. And the highest end of it is that up to 50% of duties, and he's imposed the 50% now. So now the measures are also following U.S. Complaints that also involve Canadian dairy products, the quotas, as well as the restrictions on the American liquor in, like, for example, in Ontario, the LCBO, and the automotive trade policies. So this collapse really demonstrates why this earlier, if you recall, this was like a 3-day extension. And even though both sides were careful to say an agreement has not been signed, but this is a part where this trade war could escalate. Now the Americans are saying that if Canada puts retaliatory tariffs, then it's going to snowball. So Canada can use retaliation to create American political pressure, but it also has to avoid increasing costs when it comes to input on Canadian companies that cannot easily replace. So it'll be a case where Canadian exports will be hurt because they'll just be too expensive to send to the United States. And on top of that, American goods will have a high tariff on it. So it'll be expensive for Canadians consuming American goods as well. So this is a very tricky situation for the prime minister, of course, and that's why the Conservatives, the official opposition, is asking to see what was at the discussion table, what were the items, and what exactly fell apart. And so that needs to be revealed to the public to understand really what took place, because this really will affect an estimate of 90,000 jobs that will be at risk if this continues and this trade war escalates. The collapse means Canada and the United States are entering a very more serious, potentially prolonged tariff conflict between the two countries. And because the economies, right, you have about over $3 billion a day that crosses the border between Canada and the United States every day. And because the economies are so deeply integrated, I mean, you can't avoid it that both countries will suffer. And Canada is, of course, more exposed because the United States is its biggest customer. And so that's where things are at. This is an evolving story, and we're going to know more from what Ottawa has to say. The Prime Minister did say that in the coming days, he's going to also address what sort of relief the federal government is going to provide those sectors that are going to be hurt the most. But when it comes to what this means for Canada, and the greater economic risk, you're looking at more than three-quarters of the Canadian goods exports go to the United States, right? 75% go to the United States. So it makes Canada highly vulnerable to tariffs and broader disruptions. Any level of disruptions, it makes Canada very vulnerable immediately. Job losses, companies not being able to proceed, keep their doors open. We know that already there's so many automotive plants that have already closed their doors. And when it comes to automotive jobs, the auto sector doesn't have massive margins to be able to absorb that level of tariffs. So when it comes to vehicles and components that cross the border multiple times, that's going to also take a hit when you have a 50% tariff that could make Canadian-made products uneconomical and lead companies to perhaps reduce shifts, postpone investments, or just really pick up and move their production capacity. And then the greater thing here is higher prices. You have Canadian counter tariffs will increase costs for businesses and consumers buying affected American products. And what does this mean in terms of growth? Well, it all slows down because business uncertainty is going to weaken investment dollars. It's gonna stop or delay hiring processes, as well as it's going to take a huge impact on the Canadian dollar. And so there's high pressure, and Canada will have to accelerate efforts to expand trade with Europe, Asia, and other markets. But replacing the scale and the proximity of the US market will take years. This is not something that we could fix in a few weeks or even by next year. US is just, we have a border. We trade across that border. It's a little bit over $3 billion a day. So to be able to replace one of your key customers who takes 75% of your exports, it's not that easy to do in terms of a quick time frame. And if you think about the export market, it just means Canada has to now export to Europe. Then you have the delays over the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean to Asia. And it's not the same as sharing land border with another country who's your biggest customer, right? So by the Prime Minister essentially saying that he rejected the deal, it shows Ottawa has also retained some control over its foreign trade relationships, right? Not only just bowing down to its biggest customer, the United States, and what this means for its relationship with the French language speaking Canadians and the cultural policies that Canada is standing behind when it comes to Canadian sovereignty. And on the flip side, if you were to ask what this means for the United States, well, they'll have higher manufacturing costs. You have American factories that depend on Canadian aluminum, steel, energy, automotive components. So these tariffs are going to be paid by US importers, and they can eventually be passed down to the consumers. A 50% tariff is not something a company can absorb and not pass that cost on to their customer. So when it comes to how it's going to be impacted, it's going to have auto production disruptions, right? So as you have some of those US assembly plants, they can't just operate normally without specific Canadian parts that are designed to be made in Canada at the Canadian manufacturing facilities, right? So this integrated supply chain is going to make things very difficult to isolate American parts away from not using Canadian made parts for the automotive industry. And this is going to create massive economic damage, not only to Canada, but also the delay in production when it comes to American cars with its parts made in Ontario, for example. And this Canadian retaliation, well, when it comes to US farmers, manufacturers, exporters, they could lose sales when Canada applies counter tariffs or purchases from other countries. So for example, there's a counter tariff and it's expensive to import into Canada. Well, when those costs get passed down to the customer may not purchase it. So that immediately also takes an impact. So what essentially took place is we had politicians in the room negotiating on a trade deal. And because things fell apart, and the Canadians and the American population don't really know what took place in that room. That's why it's pertinent to know what took place, because really who gets impacted is the population, are the Canadians, are the Americans, because it's going to impact both sides. And when it comes to possible price increases, yes, for sure it's going to happen. When it comes to cars, when it comes to building materials, because steel, aluminum, lumber, it's going to affect appliances, food costs, and affected goods that may be more expensive. So when it comes to investments, that's also going to shift or even slow down, right? You have President Trump that wants companies to manufacture more in the United States, saying you're not going to have to deal with tariffs if you come to the United States. But when it comes to constructing factories and reorganizing supply chains, that takes several years. So those Canadian parts, auto parts that are made in Ontario, that the American parts can't do without, now they have to figure out how to get their assemblies up to par to be able to produce those Canadian made parts. That's not going to happen by October. That's going to take some time. So what this means is essentially this dispute is a massive deterioration when it comes to the relationship on both sides of what was once the closest allies, the Canadians and the Americans. And these trade negotiators are now connecting to this broader issue of what it means for sovereignty, culture, and political trust when it comes to having a partnership with America and vice versa. And the bigger question, which is the elephant in the room, is what is going to be the future of CUSMA? Now that's become less certain because these negotiations were supposed to be a broader discussion on CUSMA that's up for an annual review. So when it comes to businesses that were previously assume that North American trade rules were stable, right? Because we've done business for so long with the Americans with the Canadians, because we believed it's stable, it's reliable, it's predictable. Well, now that confidence has also weakened and it's become anything but reliable. And so when you have the bigger announcement again that President Trump is also threatening another set of tariffs come January 1st. So happy New Year, happy 2027. Here's another round of tariffs. This is something that he said. Now, January 1st is a long, far away, and we know a lot can happen until then. We know the political cycle changes quite fast, and news story changes quite fast. 1 week is even too long. So, we're talking about, it feels like another decade in a political cycle, which is just January 1st. Now, the president says that the January 1st tariffs may, take effect on certain parts, and this is if things are not negotiated well in advance. But this is a time where it's also said that Ottawa is saying that Canada is unlikely to accept any deal that allows Washington to control its relationship with other countries or override domestic language or cultural policies. So Canada's essentially, drawn the line in the sand when it comes to the Americans and what it can and cannot do. But then you have President Trump, who's threatened another 50% of tariffs on Canadian vehicles, auto parts, and steel starting January 1st. So does that just add up to 100%? Because it's 50% now and another 50% January 1st. So this is something that the president has now thrown in there as a Happy New Year gift for January 1st, 2027, and what would be an escalating trade war following these collapse negotiations that are now going to impact $28 billion worth of Canadian goods that get exported into the United States. Of course, this is a developing story. We're going to see what is going to happen, what Ottawa announces in the coming days for a relief for those industries, and what is going to be on the list that's going to be launched on the retaliatory tariffs against the United States on September 8th. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.